The Jackson Street Cemetery, also known as the Old Athens Cemetery, is one of the first burial places in Athens. It has become a resting place for soldiers from the Revolutionary and Civil War. Two UGA presidents are also buried in the cemetery. It is not mentioned in the historical records, but a lot of enslaved African Americans also lie there. The cemetery lies right on campus next to Baldwin Hall and the Technology Center for the College of Environmental and Design. It is so interesting how something so new such as the Technology Center that is so modern and up to date is located right next to one of the oldest and most aged places on campus. The cemetery is located directly in front of the UGA's main library and one of the busiest bus stops on campus. Hundreds of students walk by the cemetery every day without even giving it a second glance. There is a gate to get in, and one of the first things I noticed is an unknown grave adjacent to the gate. The graves in the cemetery are scattered with no sense of organization. There is a sign at the gate telling people about the fragile state of the graves. This section of the graveyard was the nicest and most well-kept part, located near the street. I think this was done purposely to show off the nicest part of the cemetery first, because beyond that section the cemetery was really run down. The words on the gravestones were so deteriorated that they were illegible and the grass and weeds were not cut. The other cemetery in Athens, the Oconee Hill Cemetery, has people come in daily and tend to the weeds and bushes. I feel like due to the old age of the cemetery, coupled with the fact that no one has been buried here since the 1800s, the landscape has been and will remain unattended. It was extremely disheartening to think about how unkept this cemetery was, especially compared to the Oconee Hill Cemetery. I was uncomfortable walking through the cemetery because it made me think about those who rest there and are forgotten about. Reading about how there were so many unmarked graves made me nervous that while walking around the cemetery, I could be stepping on people's graves. I am thankful that this experience was only my second time being in a cemetery. I have not experienced any major death in my family that has seriously affected the way I view cemeteries. It also made me wonder about my death in the cemetery I will be buried in. It made me question whether I want to be buried in a cemetery at all. The graves in the cemetery were from the 1800s. Nobody personally knows anybody buried there. Do I want to be buried in a place where in 100 years nobody is going to remember me and I'm going to be another person among the graves? There were visible signs of repair being done, but I visited the cemetery 3 to 4 times and there was no progress throughout my visits. When leaving the cemetery, it made me think about how the cemetery does not look like how it did in the 1815s. The cemetery extended way past the gated area that is now shown. It is only about 2.5 acres now. It makes you wonder how far the cemetery actually did extend to. Lots of federal funds were allocated to UGA to expand campus building projects. Baldwin Hall was built right on the edge of the old university graveyard. During the construction, the remains of enslaved African Americans were found. Not much was taken into account, and the remains were put into a mass grave and relocated to Nowhere Road or thrown into the dump. This brought up a lot of controversy in how it is extremely disrespectful of the university to dig up those remains and move them in order to expand the building. It was said that the university knew about the bodies when they decided to expand the building, and this recognized the history of racism that is prominent at the university. It made me realize that the racism 100 years ago is still present today. This is comparable to the recent racist incident that occurred on campus with the fraternities. There is a memorial that is created in front of Baldwin Hall in order to remember those that were found. This knowledge about the history of our university is something I will carry throughout my time here at UGA.